A 7-year-old boy crossed into a deep forest. No roads, no way out, and no guarantee he would survive. No neighbors, no shelter waiting, just a 3-sided camp, open to the cold and the darkness beyond the fire. For nearly a year, this was his world. That boy was Abraham Lincoln, and this is where his story truly begins. In December of 1816, a small family crossed the Ohio River and stepped into a different country. Years later, reflecting on that moment, Abraham Lincoln would write that they reached their new home. It was a simple line, but the simplicity of that sentence concealed the difficulty of what followed. The land that received them did not resemble the places they had left behind. It did not open. It did not offer itself easily. It stood in its original condition, dense, layered, and unbroken. The forests of southern Indiana rose in thick stands of oak and hickory, their limbs woven tightly overhead. Even in daylight, the ground beneath them held a kind of dimness, as though the sun itself could not fully enter. The undergrowth tangled across the earth, fallen branches, brush, and creeping growth that resisted every step forward. There were no paths waiting, no fields cleared, no indication that the land had ever been shaped by human hands. Only forest, and within that forest, a place that would come to be known as Little Pigeon Creek. They stopped on a slight rise of ground. It was not chosen because it offered comfort. It offered position. A vantage point, however limited, within a landscape that did not otherwise provide one. There were no nearby dwellings, no smoke rising in the distance, no sound that suggested another family lived within reach. In Kentucky, distance had existed, but it had never been absolute. The silence that surrounded them was not merely the absence of sound. It was the absence of others. It carried no echo of voices, no suggestion of shared presence, only wind moving through branches. Only the shifting of the forest itself. As the last of the light withdrew, the task before them became immediate. What had been carried across the river was set down. Tools, clothing, a small reserve of food. Everything that remained of their previous life now rested on the ground. There was no structure waiting, no enclosed space to enter. What would shelter them that night did not yet exist. And so it had to be made. Quickly, the shelter they raised was not a cabin. It was a necessity shaped by time. 3 walls of logs, set upright and joined as best they could before darkness closed in. The roof was formed from poles and brush, laid together in haste. It could interrupt the fall of snow. It could break the force of rain, but it could not hold warmth. The ground beneath remained bare. Leaves were gathered where they could be found and spread across the earth, forming a thin layer between the body and the cold. At the open side of the structure, a fire was built. It had to be. Without it, the shelter would offer almost nothing. Flame became the center of the space, light where darkness would otherwise take hold, and a measure of protection against what moved beyond its reach. In those woods, animals were present. Wolves moved through the same ground. That first night did not pass easily. Cold entered without resistance. Wind moved freely through the open side of the shelter. The fire demanded constant attention. If it weakened, the cold pressed in immediately. If it faltered, the darkness followed. Sleep, when it came, was not continuous. It was broken, interrupted. Within that 3-sided space, the idea of a home existed only as intention. The boy who had crossed the river stood within it, 7 years old, watching, listening, learning, not through instruction, but through condition. Morning did not bring relief. It brought clarity. In daylight, the forest revealed itself fully. There was no clearing, no open ground waiting to be used. Every direction led into the same resistance. Trees standing close together, brush covering the ground, fallen timber obstructing movement. If the land was to become something else, it would not happen quickly. It would have to be made. Work began immediately. The axe became the central instrument of that work. Its sound marked the beginning of each day, and its repetition carried through the hours that followed. Trees did not fall easily. Each required effort. Each required persistence. Each resisted until the final moment when resistance gave way. The fall of a tree was not the completion of a task. It was the beginning of another. Wood had to be cut further, moved, cleared. Space had to be created where none existed before. For the boy, participation did not begin all at once. It emerged, standing near, observing, then carrying what could be carried, then returning again, then continuing without being asked. There was no moment when work was assigned. It became understood. Water remained distant. It did not appear where it was needed. Each day required the same movement. Outward, then back. Food followed the same pattern. It was not stored in abundance. It was obtained, prepared, consumed, and then required again. Game, when it could be taken. Meat, preserved where possible. Cornmeal formed into ash cakes and baked within the coals. There was no separation between effort and sustenance. They were linked. Each depended on the other. Days passed, then more. Time did not announce itself clearly, but change began to appear. A small opening where light reached the ground more easily. A space where movement required less effort. A path that began to form, not because it had been designed, but because it had been used. The forest did not disappear, but it began to shift. The shelter remained unchanged. 3 walls, 1 open side, the fire still at its center. Each night, it had to be maintained. If it diminished, it had to be restored. If it failed, it had to be rebuilt. This pattern did not vary. Cold remained constant. It settled into clothing, into the ground, into the structure itself. There was no moment when it fully left. Within the shelter, Nancy Hanks Lincoln sustained something less visible than wood or flame. Continuity. Words. Thought. Even in those conditions, she maintained what she could. Reading when possible. Teaching when possible. Holding on to something that extended beyond the immediate demands of survival. There were few books, few materials, but the presence of learning did not disappear. It remained. In fragments. In moments. In persistence. Years later, Abraham Lincoln would describe his early education in simple terms. It had been limited, less than a year in total, learned by littles, not confined to one place, but gathered across these early years. Across Kentucky, and here, within this place that offered so little structure for it. Weeks became months. The isolation did not vanish, but it changed. At first, it had been something external, something that surrounded them. Now, it became something lived within. The silence remained, but it no longer felt unfamiliar. It became part of the environment itself. The work continued, always present, always required, each day repeating the last, each day adding something small, a little more space, a little more light, a little more familiarity. Winter did not end in a single moment. It loosened, gradually, almost without notice. The cold remained, but shifted. Light lingered longer. The ground changed. Time had passed, not in a way that could be easily measured, but in a way that could be seen. The shelter still stood, but it was no longer the only sign of their presence. Around it, the land had begun to open. Space existed where none had before. Movement became easier. Not easy, but possible. Accounts from those who would later recall that time described how long they remained within that first shelter. Not days, not weeks, but nearly a year. A full cycle lived within that 3-sided structure. A period that would later be remembered not for its details, but for its effect. For Abraham Lincoln, this was not a story he would later recount in full, but it was part of what shaped him. The repetition, the labor, the silence, the absence of structure, and the necessity of creating it. He did not leave that place unchanged. He could not. No one could. The forest had required something, and in responding to it, something had been formed. Not visible at once, not defined in that moment, but present, a way of enduring, a way of observing, a way of continuing, even when the outcome remained uncertain. The edge of the silence did not disappear. It remained, but it no longer stood apart. It became part of the ground itself. And within that silence, a life began to take shape.